Throughout human history, the human mind has accomplished extraordinary things, built cities, sparked revolutions, created art, science, and entire civilizations. But the same mind, when pushed, pressured, isolated, or reprogrammed, becomes capable of something far darker. Some of the most devastating tragedies in the modern world didn't begin with wars or governments or natural disasters. They began with small groups of ordinary people, following someone who promised them answers. These were communities that looked harmless from the outside: meditation groups, prayer circles, self-help workshops, spiritual movements. Yet behind closed doors, they transformed into systems of control so intense, so consuming, that they rewrote the very identity of the people inside them. Cults don't start with horror. They start with hope. A promise to heal. A promise to belong. A promise to understand a world that feels confusing, painful, or unfair. And that's why they're so terrifying. Because the people who fall into them aren't weak or unintelligent or broken. They're human. They're searching for meaning, for connection, for purpose. The same things all of us look for at different points in our lives. In this video, we're not just exploring cults as historical events. We're examining them as psychological machines, carefully engineered systems that reshape how people think, what they fear, and who they trust that will take you inside. Groups that built underground bunkers waiting for the end of the world. Movements that believed salvation required leaving their physical bodies behind. Organizations that operated like corporations on the outside, but like prisons on the inside. And families who surrendered their children, their identities, and eventually, their lives. Some of these stories ended decades ago. Some of them are happening right now, in modern cities, on social media, in online communities that look harmless until you're already inside. And with each one, you'll see a pattern emerge, a blueprint used by charismatic leaders across countries, decades, cultures, and belief systems. A step-by-step formula that begins with admiration, then dependency, then fear, and finally, obedience. We're going to break down how leaders gain total control without touching a single weapon, how they create echo chambers where doubt feels like betrayal, and how they turn ordinary followers into unwavering believers willing to give up everything they have, even their lives. By the end of this video, you'll understand not just the history, but the mind games, the psychological hooks, and the manipulation tactics that let these groups grow stronger than logic, stronger than fear, and stronger than basic human survival instinct. This isn't just a documentary about cults. It's a study of the human mind, how it can be shaped, guided, hacked, and, at its darkest moments, completely overtaken. Let's begin. Number 1. Jonestown, the People's Temple. Jonestown remains one of the largest civilian mass deaths in modern history. Over 900 people lost in a single day. But it didn't begin with fear. It began with a man who knew exactly how to make people feel seen. Jim Jones started the People's Temple in the 1950s, preaching racial unity, equality, and community support at a time when America was deeply divided. To thousands, he felt like a rare leader who genuinely cared. But underneath the compassion was control, subtle, quiet, and steadily tightening. He isolated members from their families, demanded loyalty, and turned private doubts into public confessions. People surrendered money, relationships, even their sense of self. By the time he moved his followers to the jungles of Guyana in the 1970s, they trusted him more than they trusted the outside world. Jonestown wasn't the paradise he promised. It was a settlement built on exhaustion, surveillance, and fear. Armed guards patrolled the area. Food was rationed. Letters were censored. And Jones' voice echoed through loudspeakers day and night, shaping what people thought, how they felt, and who they believed. Everything collapsed in November 1978, when a visiting U.S. congressman was murdered after several members tried to escape. Jones gathered everyone and instructed parents to give their children a cyanide mixture first, then drink it themselves. Some believed it was salvation. Some believed there was no escape. And some were too terrified to resist. When it ended, more than 900 bodies lay in rows. A community built on hope had been swallowed by control. The mind lesson. Jonestown shows how devotion can turn into dependence when one person becomes the only source of truth. It's not dramatic at first. It's slow, a steady erosion of identity until obedience feels like safety. Number 2. Aum Shinrikyo, Shoko Asahara. In the late 1980s, a partially blind yoga teacher in Japan, Shoko Asahara, founded a spiritual group that promised enlightenment, purification, and escape from a collapsing world. He called it Aum Shinrikyo, and at first glance, it looked like a harmless blend of meditation, mysticism, and New Age ideas. But Asahara wanted more than followers. He wanted absolute control, and he built his empire using fear disguised as awakening. He preached that the end of the world was coming soon, and only he had the knowledge to save people from the destruction that awaited them. Young professionals, top university students, and even scientists joined him, believing they had found a teacher who understood the meaning of life better than anyone else. Inside Aum's compounds, however, the atmosphere was nothing like the peaceful image they projected outside. Members were deprived of sleep, isolated from their families, and forced to meditate for hours while listening to Asahara's voice. Those who questioned him were punished or drugged in the name of purification. With a growing army of devoted followers, including chemists and engineers, Asahara took a darker turn. He began stockpiling weapons, experimenting with chemical agents, and predicting a global apocalypse he insisted only Aum would survive. On March 20th, 1995, Aum Shinrikyo carried out one of the most shocking terrorist attacks in modern history. Members released sarin gas on the Tokyo subway, killing 12 people and injuring thousands. The attack paralyzed an entire nation, not just with fear, but with disbelief that an apocalyptic cult had been living among them in plain sight. The mind lesson. Aum reveals how a leader can turn fear itself into a weapon, convincing people that danger is everywhere except under his control. Once fear becomes a daily language, followers stop questioning and start clinging. Number 3. Heaven's Gate, Marshall Applewhite. Heaven's Gate didn't look like a dangerous group. If anything, it looked strangely gentle, a small community of people who believed the human body was just a temporary container, and that enlightenment meant leaving it behind. But at the center of this quiet, otherworldly belief system was a man named Marshall Applewhite, whose calm voice and soft tone masked a world of unshakable control. Applewhite convinced his followers that Earth was about to be recycled, and the only way to survive was to ascend to a higher, extraterrestrial realm. To prepare, he asked them to cut off everything that tied them to their human identity: families, careers, possessions, relationships, even their names. What remained were people who lived in matching clothes, matching routines, matching thoughts, a community that had surrendered individuality in exchange for cosmic certainty. Over the years, isolation deepened. Members avoided outside influence, consumed carefully controlled information, and depended entirely on Applewhite's guidance. When the Hale-Bopp comet appeared in 1997, Applewhite announced it was the sign they had been waiting for, a vehicle hidden behind the comet that would take them to the next level. In March that year, 39 members of Heaven's Gate calmly laid down on bunk beds inside their rented home in California. Dressed identically and believing they were finally escaping a doomed planet, they consumed a lethal mixture of barbiturates and alcohol. To them, it wasn't death. It was graduation. The mind lesson. Heaven's Gate shows how identity can be quietly rewritten when someone offers a story that makes the world feel less chaotic. Once that story becomes the only reality people trust, Even the unthinkable can feel like destiny. Number 4. The Manson family, Charles Manson. In the late 1960s, Charles Manson was a nobody, a man drifting in and out of prison, carrying a guitar, and clinging to a dream of becoming a rock star. But what he lacked in talent, he made up for in something far more dangerous, an uncanny ability to read people. When he gathered a small group of young, vulnerable followers, mostly women searching for belonging, he turned their search into his power. The Manson family lived together on a dusty ranch in California, cut off from mainstream society. Manson didn't rule with threats at first. He ruled with attention. He made every new member feel chosen, special, understood. Then slowly, the tone shifted. He introduced drugs, long monologues, and nights of emotional breakdown disguised as spiritual awakening. The group stopped thinking individually. Their world narrowed until Manson's words were the only truth left. Eventually, he told them a story, that a coming race war, which he called helter-skelter, would destroy society, and they were chosen to trigger it. To the outside world, the idea was delusional. To the family, it felt like purpose. In August 1969, Manson instructed several members to carry out murders that would ignite this imagined chaos. What followed were 2 nights of brutal killings, including the murder of actress Sharon Tate and 4 others in her home. The violence shocked the world, not just because of its cruelty, but because it was committed by ordinary young people under the spell of one man. The mind lesson. The Manson family reveals how charisma becomes control when someone learns to mirror people's vulnerabilities. Once a leader turns himself into the center of someone's emotional world, logic loses its grip and devotion becomes a weapon. Number 5. The Order of the Solar Temple. In the 1980s and early 90s, a secretive group operating across Switzerland, France, and Canada began drawing in members with promises of mystical wisdom, ancient rituals, and a return to higher consciousness. They called themselves the Order of the Solar Temple, and on the surface, it resembled an exclusive spiritual society. Elegant robes, candlelit ceremonies, and teachings that blended Christianity, New Age philosophy, and occult symbolism. But behind this theatrical exterior were 2 leaders, Joseph D. Mambro and Luke Jurett, who used the mystery of ritual to hide the machinery of control. Members were told they were chosen for a sacred mission. They were convinced that humanity was corrupt, the world was doomed, and only the order understood the path to salvation. The deeper members went, the less freedom they had. Their finances, relationships, and decisions were quietly absorbed into the structure of the group. Doubts were reframed as spiritual weakness. Obedience became the measure of purity. Then the message darkened. The order claimed that the world was nearing its end, and true believers needed to transition to a higher plane of existence. That transition, they said, required leaving their earthly bodies. Between 1994 and 1997, a series of coordinated ritual deaths took place across multiple countries. Some members died by suicide. Others were murdered to maintain the illusion of divine purpose. Homes were set on fire to destroy evidence, leaving behind scenes that shocked investigators. Carefully arranged bodies, ritual objects, and recordings of the leaders predicting their departure. The mind lesson. The order shows how secrecy and ritual can create an atmosphere where questioning feels forbidden. When leaders wrap control in mysticism, followers can mistake manipulation for destiny and surrender without realizing how far they've fallen. Number 6. NXIVM, Keith Raniere. NXIVM began in the early 2000s as a sleek, corporate-style self-improvement program. It wasn't advertised as spiritual, edgy, or extreme. It looked polished: business seminars, leadership workshops, glossy brochures, and a promise to unlock your highest potential. At the center of it all was Keith Raniere, a man marketed as one of the world's smartest thinkers. The branding was modern, professional, almost scientific. And that's what made people let their guard down. Celebrities, entrepreneurs, and young professionals signed up for expensive workshops believing they were joining an elite success community. But behind the scenes, the system worked very differently. Raniere quietly built a hierarchy in which loyalty flowed upwards and obedience was rewarded. Members were encouraged to reveal their deepest fears, personal secrets, and private details during intense sessions, information that slowly became emotional collateral. Then came DOS, a secret inner circle of women recruited under the promise of empowerment. They were told they would become stronger, more disciplined, and more enlightened. Instead, they were given masters, assigned strict rules, required to provide compromising collateral, and cut off from anyone outside the group. Many were pressured into sexual relationships with Raniere. Some were branded with a hot, cauterizing pen, a symbol they were told represented strength, but in reality contained his initials. NXIVM was finally exposed in 2017, leading to Raniere's arrest and highly publicized trial. Behind its corporate exterior lay a structure built entirely on psychological leverage. The Mind Lesson. NXIVM shows how manipulation evolves when it appears modern and professional. When a system uses success, ambition, and self-improvement as bait, people don't realize they're being controlled until the cost becomes impossible to hide. Number 7. Falun Gong, Li Hongji. Falun Gong began in the early 1990s in China as a slow-moving, meditative practice combining Qigong exercises with spiritual teachings. Led by Li Hongji, the movement attracted millions within a few years, not because it looked like a cult, but because it didn't. It was peaceful, disciplined, and focused on moral values like truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. But as its following grew, so did its structure. Li's teachings expanded from simple philosophy to a detailed worldview. Followers were encouraged to cut down contact with those who questioned the movement and consume information mainly within the group. Over time, Falun Gong grew into a global network connected primarily through shared belief and loyalty to Li's teachings. To outsiders, the group appeared quiet and introspective. Inside, however, commitment often became all-consuming. Members were expected to prioritize the practice over personal relationships, medical care, or outside influences. As the movement spread internationally, closed-circle communities formed in different countries, each centered around strict interpretation of Li's writings. One of the most controversial aspects was Li's apocalyptic predictions, warnings about cosmic battles, moral purification, and humanity's spiritual decline. These ideas didn't always translate into violence, but they did create a worldview where the outside world was treated with caution, distrust, or moral distance. What makes Falun Gong particularly striking is that it operates without the typical hallmarks of cults. No communes, no compounds, no dramatic rituals. Instead, control is maintained through belief, identity, and the feeling of belonging to a morally superior mission. The Mind Lesson. Falun Gong shows how influence can grow not through threats, but through ideology. When a belief system becomes the lens through which someone interprets reality, the world outside starts to feel wrong, and the group becomes the only place that feels right. Number 8. The Unification Church, Mooney's, Sun Myung Moon. The Unification Church began in 1954, founded by Sun Myung Moon, a Korean religious leader who claimed he had been chosen to complete Jesus's unfinished mission. What started as a small spiritual movement quickly expanded into a global organization with millions of followers and an enormous influence across multiple countries. Moon's teachings centered around the idea that families were the key to restoring a fallen world. But in practice, this gave the church extraordinary control over its members' relationships, marriages, and daily lives. Followers were encouraged to cut ties with anyone who questioned the movement, donate large portions of their income, and dedicate themselves entirely to the church's mission. One of the most recognizable aspects of the Unification Church was its mass weddings, ceremonies where thousands of couples, often strangers, were matched by Moon or his representatives. To the outside world, these events looked bizarre, even theatrical. To the followers, they were sacred, a divine pairing that would purify humanity. A marriage chosen by the church wasn't just a relationship, it was a lifetime assignment. Within church communities, loyalty was reinforced through communal living, long hours of fundraising, and constant involvement in church activities. Members spent so much time within the group that outside life slowly became foreign. The movement still exists today, with leadership passing to Moon's family after his death. Much of its power now lies in its intergenerational structure. Children raised within the church often grow into adults deeply tied to its identity and worldview. The Mind Lesson. The Unification Church shows how control can be maintained through structure rather than fear. When a group directs someone's relationships, family life, and sense of purpose, it doesn't need threats. Identity becomes the cage and the key. Number 9. Scientology, the machinery of total control. Scientology stands apart from most cults because it doesn't look like one at first glance. It presents itself as a self-improvement movement, a path to clarity, confidence, and psychological freedom. But beneath the polished exterior is one of the most sophisticated control systems ever engineered. The foundation of Scientology's manipulation is auditing, a confessional process where members reveal their deepest fears, traumas, secrets, and mistakes while hooked up to a device called an e-meter. What begins as spiritual counseling gradually becomes a mechanism for extracting personal information that can be used to shame, silence, or control dissent. Once someone is invested, Scientology steers them into a labyrinth of financial dependency. Courses escalate in price at an astonishing rate, each one framed as essential for spiritual advancement. Members are encouraged, sometimes pressured, to take loans, max out credit cards, or donate beyond their means in the pursuit of higher operating thetan levels. As they climb, the emotional and financial sunk cost becomes impossible to escape. Parallel to this is a culture of surveillance and punishment. Members who question leadership are labeled suppressive persons, effectively enemies of the church, and are isolated through a strict policy of disconnection. Families are split, friendships severed, careers jeopardized. Internal policing units monitor behavior, encouraging members to report each other for perceived disloyalty. Scientology's terror isn't chaotic or impulsive, it is institutionalized. It is a system built on extracting secrets, exploiting vulnerability, and conditioning fear so deeply that leaving feels more dangerous than staying. Number 10. The 12 Tribes, a life rewritten from birth. The 12 Tribes doesn't rely on dramatic prophecies or apocalyptic promises. Its power lies in something far more subtle, total life restructuring. Founded in the 1970s, it presents itself as a gentle, faith-driven community built on simplicity, hard work, and shared purpose. But once inside, members find themselves absorbed into a system where individuality is quietly erased, and the community becomes the only world that exists. The group operates through communal isolation, shared homes, shared finances, shared labor. Every daily choice, from clothing to parenting to who you speak to, is dictated by the group's strict hierarchy. Outsiders are viewed as corrupt and spiritually dangerous, leaving members increasingly dependent on the community for identity, stability, and belonging. Roles are rigidly assigned. Women are expected to submit to male authority. Children are disciplined harshly, and questioning the rules is treated as a moral failure. New members often join believing they've found purpose. Within months, they're conditioned to follow a set of behaviors that feel less like spiritual commitment and more like social captivity. Where the 12 tribes becomes truly haunting is how it shapes children from birth. Kids grow up entirely within this system, homeschooled, isolated, and trained to obey without hesitation. Their worldview isn't persuaded, it's implanted. By adulthood, leaving doesn't just mean escaping a group. It means abandoning the only world they've ever understood. This is a cult built not through charismatic frenzy, but through lifelong conditioning, dependency loops, and the quiet removal of personal agency until obedience feels natural, even inevitable. When we look at these 10 cults side by side, they might seem like distant stories, dramatic tragedies from another time, another place, another sort of person. But the truth is far more unsettling. None of these groups began with monsters and victims. They began with ordinary people who wanted purpose, certainty, belonging, healing, or a sense of direction. And the individuals who led them understood one thing very well. The mind will follow the voice that offers clarity in moments of confusion. Across every story we explored, a pattern quietly repeats itself. A charismatic leader steps in not as a villain, but as a savior. He promises answers when life feels overwhelming. He creates us versus them narratives that make followers feel special, chosen, protected. He isolates them, physically, emotionally, or psychologically, until the outside world becomes suspicious and the inside world becomes the only safe place left. From Jonestown's tragic surrender of free will to the calculated mysticism of Shinrikyo, from Heaven's Gate's promise of escape to the institutional control of Scientology, these leaders don't just manipulate beliefs. They reshape identity. They rewrite what loyalty means. They rewire how fear works. And they gradually train people to obey not because they are weak, but because their environment has been rebuilt around them. The methods differ, but the blueprint stays eerily consistent. Isolation, so your world shrinks. A love bombing, so you feel seen. A fear conditioning, so you stop questioning. Identity erosion, so you forget who you were. Dependency loops, so leaving feels impossible. This isn't psychology in a textbook sense. This is the behavioral architecture of human vulnerability, the part of our mind that seeks safety, connection, and meaning, even when the cost becomes dangerous. And this is exactly why I created Mind Lab Studio. Because the world isn't just shaped by logic, it's shaped by stories, emotions, and the ways people use both to influence our decisions. Cults may look extreme, but the same principles appear in far more everyday places. Controlling relationships, manipulative workplaces, online echo chambers, charismatic figures who turn doubt into devotion. The difference is scale, not mechanism. So when we study these groups, we're not just looking back at history. We're learning the early warning signs of manipulation. When someone asks for loyalty before trust, when they tell you the world outside is dangerous, when they promise transformation but demand obedience, when they slowly disconnect you from your own voice. Because that is how it always begins, quietly, gently, almost invisibly. And that is why understanding the mind is our greatest protection, not to fear the world, but to navigate it with sharper awareness. And to remember that even the strongest minds can be influenced when someone learns how to speak to their fears, their hopes, and their need for belonging. These stories aren't reminders of how strange people can be. They're reminders of how human we all are.